Greetings YouTube viewers and welcome to another video on the Ian Bullock channel. Today is Tuesday, April the 4th, 2023 and I'm recording this video from the centre of Norwich here in Norfolk, East Anglia, United Kingdom, because I wanted to talk to you a little bit more today about 3 years of life with coronavirus, Covid-19, and how Norwich and other towns and cities have coped with the global Covid-19 pandemic. So I'm standing at the moment in Surrey Street, which is really the home of the insurance giant Aviva, formerly Norwich Union, and what we're seeing here are the modern and older offices of Norwich Union here in the heart of the city centre. Now, if I'd been standing here 3 years ago in March, April 2020, this would have been a very different scene because, of course, we had to have national lockdowns due to the coronavirus spreading around the world. Whereas today, as you can see, not only is it a beautifully sunny day in the school Easter holidays, but also pretty busy. So back in September 2020, I recorded a video for my YouTube channel about life in Norwich in 2020, a truly terrible year, as I called it, because at the time I was trying to kind of capture a moment in time, a moment in UK and global history, I suppose, where the country and the city here in Norwich were trying to cope with coronavirus and the 3 national lockdowns that we had. And life really was a bit of a struggle. And so the purpose of today's video is that I wanted to talk about where we are now with life in Norwich and Norfolk here in 2023, 3 years later, and just to reflect a little bit about what's been going on over a very, very challenging 3-year period. So while I'm talking about coronavirus, I thought I'd take my viewers on a little tour around the busy and historic heart of Norwich city centre, and that will include the award-winning covered market. And I went there on my video in 2020, but things were a lot different in those days. We'd come out of one of the national lockdowns and a lot of people were wearing face masks, face coverings, and also having to follow a particular route around the covered market as part of the coronavirus precautions at the time. So here we are on this beautiful day in April 2023, and I'll tell you now about life with coronavirus. When I recorded my video in September 2020, at the time I did check out the number of deaths in the UK from the virus, and at the time I think it was at about 42,000. Now I'm really sad to have to say that here we are in 2023, and after 3 years with coronavirus, the figure for the UK now stands at something like 222,000 people have died with this terrible contagious illness. Now back at the time, September 2020, I kind of figured that by 2023 I myself would have suffered from coronavirus, because it was really rampant at the time, and loads of people that I know, particularly Facebook people, were catching it quite quickly and being quite ill. But interestingly, here in April 2023 and 3 years on, I've never actually had Covid-19. And I don't quite know how that's happened, but I'll talk to you about that a little bit more as this video goes on. So as far as we know, coronavirus, Covid-19, first started in the city of Wuhan in China in late 2019, and very quickly started to spread from China really across the world, and it didn't take long before it had reached mainland continental Europe and then of course the UK. And by sort of February, March time, it was seriously affecting the UK, and that's when the Conservative government of the day decided to embark upon this policy of national lockdowns. So back in those early days, I rather imagined, probably naively, that coronavirus would stay contained within China and Asia. And I never realised at the time the sort of catastrophic effects and repercussions it was going to have really around the world, including here in the UK. And back in those days, sort of January, February, March 2020, I was working as a taxi driver here in Norwich, a private hire vehicle driver. And I suppose in about February, March, I began to notice that some of my passengers were international students from the University of East Anglia. And on a couple of occasions, I had some Chinese passengers who I think were flying from Beijing across via Amsterdam and onto Norwich Airport. And when I was collecting them in my taxi here in Norwich at the airport, I was really one of the first British people that they were meeting. So I was dealing with their suitcases and they were jumping in the taxi. And it was at that point that, it doesn't sound like a very politically correct thing to say, but it was at that point I really began to feel that I was putting myself in the front line of possibly contracting coronavirus. And at the time that was extremely worrying. My concern was that I would contract the illness from one of the passengers, and actually my last ever shift as a taxi driver was in mid-March 2020, and even on that night I think I had 4 international students in the car wearing those disposable face masks, and I took them from the university to the Chinese restaurant in Prince of Wales Road. And there were 4 of them in the car, 3 in the back seat, 1 in the front. I didn't have a mask on. And my concern was that if I picked up the illness, I would possibly give it to my wife, who has underlying health conditions, and I'm in my late 50s anyway. So I really decided at that point, rightly or wrongly, that I was going to step back from taxi driving and keep myself and my family safe. And I actually took early retirement then. I think I was 56, heading for 57. So I gave up the taxi driving, and the rest is history really, because I haven't really worked throughout the entire period that the pandemic has affected the UK. So I'm about to head into Norwich's famous and historic Royal Arcade. So back in the early days of coronavirus, it was generally accepted that the disease had started in the city of Wuhan in China. And initially, I think it was known as the Wuhan influenza and Wuhan coronavirus. That was subsequently changed by the World Health Organization to Covid-19, COVID, which stands for coronavirus disease, and 19 being the year when the disease originated. And there's been several schools of thought about how this disease began. Some people say it was something to do with so-called wet markets, animal markets in China, where various weird and wonderful creatures were being kept. I think they talked about red foxes, raccoon dogs, badger hogs, and at one point bats and pangolins, pangolins being spiny anteaters, I think. And there was a suggestion that the disease had somehow jumped across from those mammals to humans, with absolutely catastrophic effects, of course. Another school of thought was that the disease had been originated in a research laboratory in Wuhan as part of a germ warfare development program, and that the disease had somehow escaped from that laboratory and caused havoc around the world. But I don't think we'll ever really get to the bottom of what started coronavirus. And without liking to get too political about these things, I don't think that China as a nation has really been held to account over what actually it did. And I don't think there's been any reparation or anything. It's just been as if the world has just kind of given up on it. And I think the way the Chinese nation is, pretty secretive nation, I don't really think we'll ever quite get to the bottom of what happened there. But the facts are we had to live through it, and it caused terrible, terrible problems around the world. And here we are just emerging from it now in 2023 as best we can after a very, very difficult 3 years. So we're just inside the famous Royal Arcade here in Norwich, which features in one of my other YouTube videos actually about the Norfolk architect George Skipper, because this was one of his architectural gems. I think you'll agree it's a beautiful shopping arcade once used by the rich and famous of Norfolk back in the day. And we're just looking out now onto Norwich's covered market in the city centre. And I suppose this is the point at which I really need to issue a kind of disclaimer in case I'm sued for libel, to say that this market isn't a wet market like the ones in Wuhan, and they don't keep live mammals or anything dodgy like that. So yeah, this market is very, very popular and really a focal point in the city centre, and I think seems to have weathered the economic storm very well, and as far as I know is going from strength to strength. So I'm just standing at the moment in Gentleman's Walk here in Norwich, and you can see City Hall, the home of Norwich City Council, in the background, and in front of it here the covered market. And I'll take you in there in a moment and just talk a little bit about why I don't appear to have ever had coronavirus during the past 3 years of the pandemic. Now, I know what you're going to say, pride comes before a fall and all that, and you can talk these things up and speak too soon, but as things stand, April 2023, I don't think I've ever had Covid-19 during the time that we've been living with this virus. And if I do get it, which will probably happen soon after filming this video, I'll put a note in the comments below on the YouTube channel and just tell you what happened. I'll probably even make a video about it, knowing me. But as things stand at the moment, I haven't had it. And I'll just go through one or two theories as to how that might have happened. As I understand it, something like 10.3 million people in England, that's not the UK, in England, haven't actually ever had Covid-19. And whereas 82% of the population has. So we're talking something like 1 in 5 people have never actually had it. And that, as far as I know, includes me. And the people who've never had COVID have been described as COVID dodgers, COVID novids, and also COVID virgins. I'm just in the middle of the market here, so as you can see it's quite busy. And back in the day, as I said, you used to have to follow little sticky arrow signs on the floor telling you which direction to go in, but and also you had to wear a face mask, but they're not really doing that anymore. But yeah, it's just a question of how I seem to have managed to avoid contracting this virus during all these years. So the first theory is that I just haven't had it. I've just been incredibly lucky and haven't had COVID-19. The second theory is that I've actually had it asymptomatically. Now, a number of people have had COVID asymptomatically, and this is where you get the virus and you have it in your system for a while, but you actually display no symptoms of having it. So really you're unaware of it, and you don't test for it or anything, and you don't get logged as one of the official sufferers. Now, I may have had that, and as far as I know, I may have actually been one of Norfolk's secret super spreaders and have given it to a whole lot of other people unwittingly. But as far as I know, I never have had it, and I think if I had had it, my wife would have also got it. And with her health problems, she may well have suffered. This was all in the period before we had vaccines and we weren't immunised. So yeah, I don't think I've had it, and I don't think I was asymptomatic. So I'm kind of discounting that theory. One of the other theories, of course, is that I did actually contract coronavirus, but it sort of got cleared from my body by my defence systems before it was really able to establish itself. I think they call that an abortive infection. So that could have been one of the reasons why. Just going to make my way down past all these chip shops. And I suppose the last theory is that I have just never been anywhere where the disease has been. But I find that quite hard to believe, really, because back in the day, not necessarily during the lockdowns, but during all the problems that we had with coronavirus, I was out and about doing all sorts of things, the supermarket shopping, going to pick up prescriptions, picking up prescriptions and groceries for neighbours and things, walking the dog. So I was out and about, not doing anything dangerous, but certainly I was out and about where the virus existed. But just somehow I never seemed to contract it, which I'm very, very pleased about. And as I say, I'm not really seeking to take anything away from the terrible trail of death and destruction that COVID brought to the UK and around the world, really. But I just think it's an interesting point as a matter of principle, really, as to how you can get through 3 years of the virus without ever contracting it. And I know that a lot of people I know have had it several times, actually. They've been reinfected no end of times. But I do admittedly know people who haven't had it, including my wife and some of our friends. But yeah, I've certainly been out and about while the virus has been around. I just don't seem to have ever got it. And now, of course, I've had my jab, so I do have that extra level of protection. The other thing, of course, about not having ever been anywhere near where the disease is slightly misleading, because during the terrible heat wave that we had in July last year, July 2022, the record-breaking heat wave, my son, Greg, who's now 24, Gregory Edward Ian Bullock, he's now 24, he rang me up one day and he said to me, I'm eating a tuna and mayo baguette, but everything I eat tastes of metallic tomato ketchup. And I said to him, I think that might be COVID, because COVID at the time was associated with a change in taste or smell. And he said, no, it isn't COVID, everything tastes of metallic tomato ketchup. And I told him to take a test, and indeed he was positive. And he had to isolate in his room at our house for quite a few days, actually. And he was living within our house with COVID, and even then I didn't contract it, so that was extremely useful. And then last Christmas, on Christmas Eve, we met some friends of ours for a coffee just before Christmas, spent a couple of hours with them, and then gave them a hug and shook their hands and said goodbye and wished them Merry Christmas. And that was Christmas Eve. And then by Boxing Day, both of them came down with COVID and were extremely ill during January 2023. So we'd been with them on Christmas Eve, and by Boxing Day they'd both gone down with the illness. So, and even then my wife and I didn't seem to get it. So yeah, we've had some pretty close shaves, I'd say, but we seem to have escaped it so far. So we are really the one in fives of the English population who so far seem to have managed to have got through 3 years of the pandemic without actually getting COVID-19 itself. But as I say, I will probably put a little comment on the comments below when and if I do finally contract it myself. So as you'll have noticed from this video, Norwich is really bustling. It's the school Easter holidays, a lovely sunny day here in the centre of the city. And I think it's true to say that this is a city that's kind of trying very hard to get back on its feet economically after COVID and various other problems. There's really been a kind of perfect storm here in the UK. We've had COVID, getting through the lockdowns and trying to get back into action. There's also a cost of living crisis. The war in Ukraine with the invasion of Russia has affected all kind of supply chain issues and energy prices. We have high inflation, higher interest rates, and really everyone's struggling with all kinds of problems. So Covid was just the start of it really, and things seem to have degenerated ever since. But certainly the scenes that you're seeing here from Norwich city centre would suggest a city that's really becoming busier and trying to recover from everything that's been thrown at it in that time. There's been a lot of things that we had to do because of coronavirus that I've never experienced before in my lifetime. I'll be 60 this summer, and I'm not necessarily saying that I'll bounce my grandson on my knee and tell him about COVID, much like our own grandparents talked about life through the war, but certainly it was an incredibly memorable and unusual, if very unpleasant experience. But during that time, of course, we had this emphasis on sanitising everything with sanitisers and washing our hands, elbow bumping instead of shaking hands to try to prevent the spread of germs. And some people used to sanitise all their shopping, so they'd get their shopping delivered and then leave it for 48 hours in the garage and then sanitise every single can of baked beans in case it was carrying coronavirus, because at that time there was quite an emphasis on the possibility of the virus being spread through surfaces and touching surfaces. Not so much emphasis on that anymore. It seems to be more of an airborne vapour disease that spreads from people's breath. But back in the day, there was this big focus on sanitising everything, surfaces, door handles, doorbells. At the time, money was taken really off the market and replaced with contactless payments. The use of notes and coins was really discouraged during, a year or two of coronavirus, really. And people had to use contactless because there was just this theory that passing a £5 note from one person to another could infect them with this potentially deadly virus. So all sorts of things have happened. Another one was not being able to have my hair cut. I mean, it's the first time in my lifetime that I was unable to access a hairdresser and have my hair cut. The dog couldn't have her hair cut. And that was really unprecedented in my lifetime. I'd always had haircuts and it was something I just took for granted. But life with COVID has been very, very strange indeed. Anyway, I hope that you found this video interesting, and if nothing else, you've enjoyed a little tour on foot around the streets of central Norwich here in Norfolk, East Anglia, and specifically through the busy covered market. So this is Ian Bullock, and I'm going to sign off now on Tuesday, April the 4th, and say that at the moment I'm fit and healthy, but I may well yet contract flipping coronavirus at some point in the months and weeks ahead. And if I do, I'll put a little comment in the comments below and just update people. But stay healthy, folks, stay happy and healthy, and sending out my best wishes to YouTube viewers around the world. So this is Ian Bullock signing off from Norwich and saying cheerio and look after yourselves, everyone.